trained as a moral theologian. I've been a part of the Catholic Studies Department now for 5 years, and I'm happy that the Catholic Studies Department at DePaul is affiliated with the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. This means, among other things, that over the water cooler, I get to learn quite a bit about Catholicism in the Global South, except for we don't have a water cooler anymore. We have a water bottle refill station. Tonight I'm here to introduce Celia Deane-Drummond. She has been at Notre Dame since 2011 as full professor. She has appointments in both the College of Arts and Letters and the College of Science, and her own training is in both plant physiology and systematic theology. Her most recent book is called Wisdom of the Liminal: Evolution and Other Animals in Human Becoming. And tonight, as you see, she will share with us Catholic social teaching and ecology, its promise and limits. Thank you.
I just want to start by thanking you all for coming here this evening, and thanks to Bill Kavanagh in particular for inviting me to be part of this very significant event. And it's a great privilege to be here and share with you some of my thoughts on ecology and Catholic social thought. I've been working in the area of ecology and theology ever since around the late 80s, when I was working on my doctorate on Jürgen Moltmann's theology of creation and ecology. And so for the last 25 years or so I've been trying to reflect on this, although I haven't written specifically on Catholic social thought until relatively recently. So what I would like to do to start with is look at some of the historical emergence of Catholic social thought and teaching and ecology, and you've had that already a little bit from the letter in your folders for this conference. And then I want to pull out some of the aspects of that which I think are promising in relation to how we are to think about the natural world. So one of these is the main issue is building a theological mandate for poverty and ecology, and weaving those two together. So because the issues I'm not going to do today, what I'm not going to do today is discuss the science of climate change or the science of ecology. That can come through in the questions if people want to follow that up. But because of the limitations of time, and because I think it's very important to look at what I think are some of the roots of the issue, theological and spiritual and ethical roots, I'm concentrating today on theological aspects. And then I'm going to look at some of the limits of that Catholic social thought. Quite often when people discuss Catholic social teaching, what I've noticed is there's a tendency just to reiterate what is said and not offer any kind of critique or moving on or even discussion of problems, etc. I want to face some of the issues which I think could be either questioned or elaborated on further. And then, not to leave us on that negative note, I'm going to look at beyond limits. Some of those aspects that will probably come in the encyclical, which if it's called Canticle of the Creatures, I'll be delighted. But some of those things which may, if you like, have more universal appeal. So they would be appealing not just to Christians, although they could appeal to those in particular, or Catholics, but maybe more universal appeal in a cross-cultural, inter-religious world. And then I hope that will generate a bit of a lively discussion. So, the historical emergence. One of the first issues that's worth thinking about is Benedict XVI really the first green pope or not? Certainly, as far as the Vatican was concerned, it was the first time that the Vatican, the first state to become a carbon neutral state. But my thesis is that Benedict XVI didn't really offer anything radically new. And I don't think Pope Francis will offer anything radically new either. And I hope by the end of today, you'll realise why I'm saying that. He will build on what I will call minor themes in past Catholic social thought, but develop them in a new way. So that's always been the case with every single encyclical. There's never been a radical change, and I don't think we can expect anything like that. And also, I would say that this is going to be his first encyclical this genuinely from his pen, given that the first one chronologically, the Life of Faith, was really a completion of what Benedict XVI was doing, with a few additional notes from himself. So, and then if we go back a little bit further to what could be called the birth of eco-theology, we have to look at the significance of Rachel Carson that Michael Northcote mentioned. Was it only yesterday? It seems a lifetime away. And her book, Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. And I think it's important to remember that she also is an American herself, and she was aware of pollution and the significance of that way before anyone else. And she had the courage to speak up and speak out. Today the issue isn't so much pollution, although that's still extremely severe, and in the cases of mining and so on, that's also the horrifying experiences we've heard this weekend about some of the polluting effects of mines and the impacts on the communities. But I would say the main, or one of the main issues at the moment, which seems to be coming to the surface in terms of global discussion, is climate change. Eco-theology is ecumenical in all its dimensions. In all the discussions I've had over the years, it's always been an ecumenical discussion. But Lynn White's accusation that Christianity was the root of the ecological crisis, as it was called then, was directed particularly at Protestants. Because what he did was he used the book of Genesis and the understanding that he believed Christians had of dominion to mean domination as a way of accusing Christianity of being one of the most anthropocentric religions that the world has ever seen. And that charge of anthropocentrism is one that I think has to be faced. But at the same time that he was writing, you also get priests and activists like Sean McDonough, who's a Colombian missionary, going out to the Philippines that we've heard so much about today, and working alongside the poorest of the poor in land use projects. So starting an alternative way of thinking through theological practice and ecology, right from the very beginning. So Lynn White's accusation, as it were, was met by objections by mostly biblical scholars again, Protestant biblical scholars and others, arguing that actually his interpretation of Genesis was incorrect. Although Peter Harrison, who's a historian, says that there have been occasions when Genesis has been interpreted in this way, and therefore we shouldn't deny that. At the same time, the ecological crisis uses apocalyptic language, and again we just had a short paper discussing the apocalyptic insights, and how are we to deal with that and reappropriate that in new and interesting ways. But the emergence of Catholic social thought on the environment was done without taking any notice of Lynn White's objections or even Rachel Carson's insights. It was done mostly through discussion of this apostolic letter, but also to some extent in Populorum Progressio, where as you saw in the letter from the Cardinal, this Pope Paul VI, as it were, started thinking about these issues at around the same sort of time that ecological awareness was coming to the surface. And this one, which dealt with the social problems of urbanization, was also the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, the 80th anniversary. And just to give you a little bit more substance on what this said, this particular letter had some sections on environmental issues, and it talked about the dramatic and unexpected consequences of human activity, as well as ill-considered exploitation of nature. So human beings have become the victim of this degradation, and the human framework is no longer under man's control. Of course, using sexist language like but humanity is intended. And in a sense, this has just continued. So the focus then is on the impact in the human sphere, and also a shared responsibility to act. But it didn't go into what those actions might entail, and so it was left vague as to what really we should do, apart from pointing out that this was a problem and an issue. But that in itself, I would say, was significant. So it's not like it was completely ignored. And then the World Synod of Catholic Bishops in Australia published this in 1971. And I would say that Australia is one of the epicentres of the world of thinking through ecology and theology. Not least because in Australia, the impact of climate change and the impact of ecological devastation is much more obvious. Farmers are aware of these incidences. The Murray-Darling River basin has been subject to huge amounts of pollution and being threatened with drying up on occasions. This particular synod didn't mince their words. There was blame for environmental impact on richer nations, a call for a simpler lifestyle, and then finally they used a biblical mandate, Romans 8, the groaning of all creation, and the vocation of Christians to do something about this. So the vocation then was to try and bring about a better world. But I would say that it took Pope John Paul II and his ministry beginning later to sow the seeds for a proper theological basis for environmental activism, environmental action. And this may come as a surprise to some of you who may not know some of these writings of Pope John Paul II. But if you follow me, you will see how, as I said, I think that this is the beginning of what I would call the theological promise of Catholic social thought. And if we are to look at how to build a theological mandate for poverty and ecology, those two woven together and never separated, then we need to look first of all at Christ in cosmological perspective. And this, as I would say, is fundamental to thinking through why it is so important for Catholics and Christians in general to think through ecological issues, because it's rooted in an understanding of who Christ is, a very traditional understanding of who Christ is. Then there's the issue of structural sin, or if you want to use the language I've used sometimes, anthropogenic sin, to reflect the fact that we have been impacting on climate change in specific ways. And then image-bearing and integral human development. And at this stage, I'm not going to query the language of development, although I'll come on to that. We've already heard a talk this afternoon on the problems of the church and development. But if you bear with me for the moment, this is the language that's used. And I don't think the language of development there is intended in an exploitative kind of way. If you just tolerate that for the moment. And then perspectives on the earth, and then finally ecological conversion and what that might mean. So I'm going to run through each of these in turn and elaborate them further. And I know it's the end of the day and the end of a very intensive few days. And I hope that if I'm going too quickly, you'll either stop me and ask a question midstream, or carry it with you until the questions afterwards. So Christ in cosmological perspective. The first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, 1979, was full of references to environmental concern. And it was astonishing to me when I started looking at this, how it seemed to have gone unnoticed. And one of the most important links here is the theological link between Christ and creation. And here's a direct quotation in case you don't believe me. In Jesus Christ, the visible world which God created for man, or humanity, the world that when sin entered was subject to futility, recovers again its original link with the divine source of wisdom and love. So Christ then restores a broken humanity and a broken earth. So the earth isn't simply for human utility. The earth is there, as it were, at the root of creation. The earth is with Christ in the beginning. So the original link with the divine source of wisdom and love is the source of Christ, the cosmic creator. And again, in a slightly later encyclical on the life of the Holy Spirit and the life of the Church, we find this, that the incarnation of the Son signifies the taking up into unity with God, not only human nature, but in this human nature, in the sense of everything that is flesh, the whole of humanity, the entire visible material world. So the incarnation signifies pulling in, and in a sense, everything, including the ecological and world in which we live. This idea of cosmic creation, or the cosmic Christ, isn't a particularly new idea. It goes back to the early church fathers, such as Maximus the Confessor. So Pope John Paul II here isn't inventing something or becoming strangely feminist, even though feminist scholars have claimed something like this for their own. But what he is doing is elaborating on the significance of Christ for the whole of the created order. Theologians now have started to talk about this in terms of deep incarnation. Deep meaning going back down into the roots of our material reality. And in addition, in Redemptor Hominis, we find there are links between different aspects of the relationships that have broken down. So you get social devastation, destruction of the natural environment, nuclear war, the lack of the respect for the unborn, and the unbridled use of technologies. All these are linked together. So the idea that something like integral development or integral ecology is something new is actually a mistake. It's actually here, even in the first encyclical of Redemptor Hominis. So the focus then is on right relationships. And the mandate to both men and women is to image God in right relationships. There isn't here a leaning towards any sort of biocentrism, but there's a reinterpretation of who we are after the image of Christ. So the idea of subduing the earth is intact, but it's after the manner of Christ's kingship, which is a servant kingship. So it's not the monarchical kingship that we have, that was just prior to the exile, that we just heard was in some sort of challenge. It's a different kind of kingship. And here's the passage where he speaks about, which we read already in the letter from Cardinal Turkson, about the priority of ethics over technology, of persons over things, of the superiority of spirit over matter. Unless you think there's some sort of implicit dualism in here, I think we need to be aware that the intention, at least, is to critique the financial and political systems, and not just have this as a theoretical understanding detached from the material realities. So the vocation of the humanity then is to mirror the work of the Creator by giving priority to work for justice and holiness over the earth, and that comes in labor in exercens. So in that particular encyclical, which is on work, we're given a new vision of what our work should entail. Next, structural sin. And one of the things which is very noticeable in all these encyclicals is how the environment and development have been deeply woven together. Development meaning consideration here for those that are in the poorest communities of the world. So bracket out problems over the language of development for the moment. So poverty and ecology aren't split, but they are considered together. In fact, they emerge together. And this compares, as I would say, with the secular literature, where ecological and environmental concerns seem to stay detached from developmental concerns until much later. So I would say, if anything, Catholic social thought moved in this direction prior to the integration of those two. So we find in this encyclical, which I'm going to label SRS for the sake of not creating too many Latin complications, super development, structures of sin, and so on. So super development is a kind of development which is bent on consumerism and bent on having more than we need. And the Genesis text, the Genesis 3:17-19, is discussed in this context. So there's wider repercussions of the fall of humanity in relation to what we've done to the earth. Goods used to excess, then, and the structures of sin are also the basis of a theological understanding of disobedience that then escalates. And we have a parallels of that escalating tendency to sin in the book of Genesis. So if we want to know, well, is there anywhere in the Bible that shows, these repercussions of sinfulness, all we have to do is look at the Genesis 2 and 3. The root of the ecological destruction in here, you may have words about this encyclical in a negative way from the point of view of political theology, but certainly at least it said this, that the root of ecological destruction is an anthropological error. And the error relates to how we understand our relationships with one another. They are distorted relationships and not functioning in the way they should. So human creativity should always be based on God's prior and original gift of the things that are. So this idea of the earth as gift and our relationships as gift comes through very strongly. So human beings must respect the prerequisites that are embedded in the natural world and God-given purposes. And this is a direct quotation here, which man can indeed develop but must never betray. And I think this is really important because, in other words, there is a sense in which what is in the structure of the ecological systems around us is there, as it were, as gift, and we cannot betray what God has given us. So that sense of giftedness is really important, and it comes up later in Benedict XVI. And as we move on, again, a true concept of development cannot ignore the use of elements of nature, the renewability of resources and the consequences of haphazard industrialization. 3 considerations that alert our consciences to the moral dimensions of development. And I'll have a little bit more to say about conscience subsequently. But the point is here, again, the interweaving of human activity with environmental responsibility. The two are kept in parallel together. And so, as we move on here to thinking about what image bearing means, the image of the gardener, which has been mentioned a number of times in this conference, comes up in a way which I think is very interesting. So, and it gives an implicit concept of sustainable development, where men and women work together to achieve their aims. So it's not any old use of the natural world, it's use which is within limits. So even though the natural world is used, it's not used with abandon, it's used in relation to divine purposes. So right exercise of dominion within the framework of obedience to divine law, that is the means of human perfection. And that, I think, is also extremely significant, that we become perfectly who we are intended to be by the way we deal with the natural world. Our exercise of dominion is the way we become perfected. And that, I think, is, as I said, I don't think the Catholic Church has really absorbed that particular mandate, that we become who we are, we become perfect through the way we exercise our dominion. So the special task of humanity then is in relation to creation, and again the quotations here from Genesis and Wisdom 9:2-3. And so so poverty and ecology cannot be thought of as split apart, but they must be thought of together. And it's in the context of the value of preserving the natural habitats of other species that this quotation comes. too little effort is made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. So it's not, human ecology here doesn't mean here the same things that the social scientists meant it to mean. It means here something a bit different because it's set in the context of preserving the natural habitat of other species. So it's an integral ecology here, even in this particular quotation. Man too is God's gift to man. He must therefore respect the natural and moral structure with which he has been endowed. So again, this idea of the gift, the giftedness of who we are, and the what you could call the ontological, if you want to use that word, is a fancy philosophical term meaning our sense of being. That sense of being, the conditions for human flourishing, come from a theological sense of who we are. And I'm now going to move to the fourth aspect of the theological mandate, which we can pick up in these encyclicals, which is perspectives on the earth. So there are some references to domination in SRS, but it is also edging towards an alternative. And this is really interesting to me, that it is, if you like, mixed. So nature rebels against him and no longer recognizes him as its master, for he has tarnished the divine image in himself. So this is what happens when things go wrong, that nature starts to have a sense of agency. And that I think is really interesting. It's not a major theme in this encyclical, because this encyclical also talks about domination. And one of the criticisms I will have is that there's inconsistencies. But I think what's interesting here, that it's here at all. And it's not just a one-off either. You can also find it somewhere else in Sentimus Annus. So instead of carrying out his role as co-operator with God in the work of creation, man sets himself up in the place of God, and this ends up provoking a rebellion on the part of nature, which is more tyrannized than governed by him. This idea of edging towards a sense of agency in nature is something which Leonardo Boff has taken up in his work, but he's used the Gaia theory in a way that I suspect that Pope Francis will not. I'm not going to talk about the Gaia theory, but I can talk about that in the questions afterwards. But just to summarise very briefly, the Gaia theory maintains that the sum total of all the biota on the Earth creates the conditions for creating a stable Earth. And so that, in a sense, forms the prior conditions on which human beings can flourish. But it can also lead, because Gaia is also the Earth goddess, it can also have some religious and philosophical implications which have bothered people like, say, Pope Benedict XVI in particular. But at the same time, it's true to say that without a functional Earth, all are doomed anyway. And if we don't recognise that, then in a sense, this is one of the reasons why these kinds of languages are starting to be used. So Benedict XVI was worried more about the science, the relationship between scientific understanding of the natural world, and how the understanding of who we are and what the natural world is a result of chance or evolutionary determinism. So he was wary of a naturalistic bent in science, which reduces the worth of nature to what he calls, quote, a collection of contingent data. Instead, the earth is gift, and then he reinforces then the Centimus Annus idea. There's relatively little attention to the common good so far in understanding, or weaving in the common good to include environmental questions. But there are other passages as well which also speak about the value of nature that you've got, or the natural world that you've got in the letter from Cardinal Turkson. But the fifth aspect I'd like to highlight is the idea of ecological conversion, because that's again something that was missed out in his letter. And the problem here is identified by Pope John Paul II as a theological one, as a result of distorted relations between the individuals and also between the individual and the collective. And in order to address that problem, he uses this language of ecological conversion. And it comes in a letter to the bishops where he says, so listen all bishops present, there is a need for ecological conversion to which bishops themselves can contribute by their teaching about the correct relationship of human beings with nature. Seen in the light of the doctrine of God the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, this relationship is one of stewardship. Human beings are set at the centre of creation as stewards of the Creator. So of course humans are still central, but also their understanding is one of stewardship after the pattern of Christ. So it's a servant stewardship, not a sort of managerial kind of stewardship. And what's really important too is that he joined this teaching also with Bartholomew I. They wrote a joint letter together, and Pope Francis has also written a joint letter with Bartholomew I. And he says this: a solution at they say this: the solution at the economic and the technological level can be found only if we undergo, in the most radical way, an inner change of heart, which can lead to a change in lifestyle of unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. A genuine conversion in Christ will enable us to change the way we think and act. So just as this deep incarnation, the understanding of Christ being the root of all our right relationships of creation, and the structural sin, so in order to move away from those, we need a metanoia, an inner change of heart, a conversion to Christ as well as a conversion to ecology, as it were. So the ecological conversion is not just about a turn to nature, it's also about a turn to Christ. And incidentally, this is exactly what Francis of Assisi always claimed as well. He didn't just preach to the birds, as it were, he also tried to convert others to Christ. So let's now look at limits. First of all, lack of consistency. You'll notice that I've shown you quotations which talk about the agency of nature in some encyclicals, but even within the same encyclical, there's also discussion about domination of the natural world, as well as a discussion about dominion, and dominion not being interpreted in an oppressive kind of way. So the status of the natural world, and nature in particular, is often unclear. Is it dominate, subdue, wonder, awe, or respect? What does use mean, and so on and so forth. It's also naive in its socio-political and ecological analysis. I don't need a social scientist or a political theologian to tell me that. The details are not really worked out, often left vague. There is often a discussion of restraint, but it's not always clear what that might mean. So what does working or acting in holiness and justice really mean in terms of political changes? There is some discussion about hoarding non-renewable energy resources by some nations, but it's still very general. There's also a possible problem with the understanding of co-creation where that language is used, because it could lead to an unfortunate hubristic sense that we are able to manage the planet in which we are situated, rather than a deeper sense of humility about our own inabilities to act. Finally, the local issues are not always dealt with adequately enough. And in addition to that, notions such as gratuitousness that come up in some of Benedict XVI's writing, especially Caritas in Veritate, gratuitous economy. It's not always clear what that gratuitous economy might mean. It sounds good, but it's not clear what it means. Incidentally, I've had a go myself at trying to interpret what it might mean in the context of genetically modified organisms and technologies. Now you could say, well, it's deliberately vague to allow theologians and others to interpret it in the way that suits them, but on the other hand, if it's left, there's a kind of a vagueness which is helpful and one that's sometimes not so helpful, and what I'm suggesting is that maybe there are times when it's not helpful enough. In other words, the examples that are given are not sufficiently grounded. There is a detachment then from what is happening on the ground with what is spelt out in some of these encyclicals. There's also a lack of proper attention to gender issues, use of sexist language, maybe that's never going to change, but not really proper attention to the real plight of women and their shouldering of a disproportionate burden of environmental injustices compared to men. So again, a lack of analysis on the social level. So far, climate change has also been avoided. That may change possibly next, but there seems some nervousness, possibly because of the political implications of this. But all you have to do is go to the Philippines and ask the Filipinos, do they think climate change exists and who causes it and so on? There's really no doubt in their minds as to what it might mean. And according to Donald Dorr, who has been cited in the first session we had from Father Perry, it's still too wedded to an anthropocentric philosophy. I think he's right to some extent, but I also think there are these other elements within it that come to the surface, and certainly if you look at the wider context of Pope John Paul II, it was clear that he was often deeply moved by the natural world, and he spoke of the wonder and awe that he found in nature as well on several occasions in Catholic social thought, as well as he took his seminarians on nature retreats. Now, I don't think he would have done that if he thought of the natural world as purely instrumental for human functional kinds of use. And so, if you like, there are elements in here of an alternative. It certainly doesn't lean towards any kind of biocentrism in the way that Leonardo Boff pushes towards himself in his own theology, liberation theology and ecology. There is occasions for a kind of idealization of global government in a way that's not always that helpful. It's certainly consistent with the bias towards centralization, although subsidiarity works in the opposite direction. So it goes back to this idea again of some inconsistencies in Catholic social thought. So you have this idealization of global government existing alongside subsidiarity. So it could be confusing. There are also controversies related to population impacts and family size, which are not really addressed. But what's interesting is that one of the doctoral students I was working with at Chester, not as a supervisor, but as someone who I advised on occasions, found that there are many radical Protestant groups that push for natality. Natality means having as many children as possible based on the commandment in Genesis to go forth and multiply. The Catholic Church has never taught natality. It may not be so good on thinking seriously enough about population impacts, but at least it hasn't pushed for that. And so if you see it in that spectrum, then it becomes more intermediate in its views. Although I have to say that Benedict XVI did talk about the idea of responsible parenthood in the context of considering environmental issues in Caritas in Veritate. So he's opened the door for at least a discussion, I think, about what that might mean. So the Catholic Church is left in a quandary, really. On the one hand, its focus on the importance of the human person, and every living child that comes into the world is to be valued and welcomed. But on the other hand, there are the issue of population growth, which in addition to overconsumption by a proportion of that population, is leading to strains on the planet and what you might call beyond the carrying capacity of planet Earth. So it's just one factor, as it were, that needs to be factored in. But what about then beyond limits? How are we going to move forward? And maybe these are kind of not exactly guesses, but these are the aspects which I think are going to have more universal appeal in anything that Pope Francis may or may not come to say. I'm not in a position to be a prophet or predict exactly what he might say, but I do think there are certain features of Catholic social thought which he may well retrieve, and which would be helpful if he retrieved, as well as things which I think will appeal on a more universal level to those of other religious traditions or none. So maybe environmental activists and others who are perhaps working in this area. The first one is the idea of the virtues, and we already have one paper on ecological virtue ethics. But in particular, these ones of contemplation, mercy, compassion, humility, respect, wisdom, faith, and hope. And all of these are valuable outside the household of faith. They're recognised by people whether they're believers or not. And in that sense, I think they are important. But these two in particular, temperance and chastity, as well as the ascetic tradition, I think are more specifically directed to the ecclesial community. Although temperance is one that I think is beginning to catch on in the secular world as well. And by chastity, I'm meaning here of the broadest sense of what that means in terms of restraint. Because it is, in the classic tradition, it was interwoven with this understanding of temperance. But at the same time, it's countered by what you could call the virtue or the gift, as it were, of joy. And I'm going to come back to that again later. So it's not a chastity that is self-punishing, it's one that's joyful as well. And I think that in an economy bent on economic growth, especially in the West, it's very important to recover these aspects of the tradition if we're going to move forward in a useful kind of way. Mercy is also extremely important. This idea of mercy, I think, is one that, or love towards the natural world in a particular way. And it's not something that's completely new either, because if you look at this encyclical published in 1980 by Pope John Paul II, he says this, that the word and the concept of mercy seem to cause uneasiness in man, who, thanks to the enormous development of science and technology, never before known in history, has become the master of the earth and has subdued and dominated it. Read for that, the Anthropocene. This dominion over the earth, sometimes understood in a one-sided and superficial way, seems to leave no room for mercy. And I have a suspicion that this thread will be picked up by Pope Francis, because it ties in with his own attitudes and also his intent really to show compassion and mercy, not just to brothers and sisters who are human, but also the creaturely world and the creatures themselves. In addition to that, peace and solidarity, I think, are also extremely important in this context. And there are precedents for this in the World Day Messages of Peace. And peacemaking is something that we also heard from Brother Perry in the first talk in this conference. And peace with the earth is a typically Franciscan tradition as well. And peace has its spiritual roots. And And we need a greater emphasis on this in the face of climate adaptation and some of the conflicts that are likely as a result of some of the shortages of water, the struggles over resources and so on, mean that conflicts are on the horizon. And what we need to do is start building for a peaceful world in anticipation of those conflicts rather than waiting for them to happen and then trying to repair the damage. So we need to build those structures, those resilient communities that will have the resilience, the moral resilience, to withstand some of the changes that are ahead. Even the US Navy has started to take climate change seriously, and some of the threats that are in the offing, as it were. In addition to that, there cannot be peace without justice. Justice making is extremely important. And this kind of justice is justice as virtue as well as justice in terms of legal frameworks. So the legal frameworks might help to put in place some structural dimensions that are significant, but we also need to have develop justice as virtue as individuals and as communities. Certainly in the legal aspects will be dealt with through the COP21 agreement, the Conference of Parties agreement, which is happening in Paris this year. And I believe that as this encyclical will come out significantly a few months before these negotiations, it may build up an intent that was similar to COP15 in 2009. Now in 2009, and I was part of that COP15 process because I went with CAFOD to Copenhagen, there was an intense anticipation that something significant was going to happen in terms of international agreement. But just before that meeting, there was ClimateGate, when some leaked emails were over-exaggerated in terms of the science, and that largely deflated public opinion in support of any lasting change. So it was really sabotaged through climate skeptics. Years on, since then, the doubters have been proved wrong. And so therefore, on that basis, I think releasing this encyclical in the build-up towards COP21 may actually nudge it towards something which is going to be more worthwhile than the meetings that have taken place since. So there needs to be attention then to environmental justice and ecological justice. By environmental justice, I mean the disproportionate impact of environmental harms on the poorest of the poor. And we've had some really graphic examples in this conference, examples from the Philippines and from Honduras that I will carry away with me in my memory from seeing the videos and other slides that we've seen. And I want to thank the presenters for doing that, because what I think is that those examples remind us of the significance of environmental injustices and how we should act to change those. But in addition to that, there's the issue of ecological injustices as well. The species extinction, so it's the extinction of myriads of species, the biota, as it were. And even if you don't believe Lovelock's Gaia theory, the more species are lost, the more unstable the planet Earth will become. So, if you like, climate change is going to become accelerated the more the biodiversity is lost. Everything is an interlocking system. And so it's important to think through environmental justice and ecological justice together rather than separately. As well as that, the just distribution of basic resources in the face of climate impacts. How are we going to become more resilient communities? Basic commodities such as water, health and education. And in this respect, liberation, the language of liberation, can replace the language of development. And one of the limits I had up on the screen was the language of sustainability and the language of development are themselves problematic. But we need to ask then, what is liberation for, in a sense? What kind of other alternatives could be put in its place? And it may be that we can think through the idea of maturation, where there's when you have no basic commodities at all, when there's nothing, then you need some provision until we reach a sort of levelling off. So it's not just growth without limits, but there's a maturation instead. And I get that word from my colleague in South Africa, Ernst Conradi, who's just written a few articles on this idea of maturation. And then collective and individual conscience. So what does justice entail? And I think we can work out what that justice might entail, or how should the church act collectively, by thinking through conscience in a collective and individual sense. I don't think that the church can speak on climate change if it continues to fail to implement ecological practices in its own structures. And I think that one of the striking features of Pope Francis's ministry so far is that he wants authenticity in the church as an institution. And if that's the case, then there needs to be more collective action by the church, by Catholic universities and Catholic colleges and Catholic schools, to start putting in place environmental awareness and environmental responsibilities in different ways. So structural sin then includes the church, whether we like it or not. We are all embedded, of course, in capitalist societies in the way that Michael Northcote has reminded us, but at the same time I think we can unpick small aspects of those ourselves. And we need to become sensitized then to this through a collective and individual conscience. And it's related to the virtue of practical wisdom, which is also operative at the individual and collective level. And I can talk more about what I think that practical wisdom or prudence might entail in the questions. But there's a need then for collective ecological responsibility. So, as a global church, we need to take bold steps in solidarity with both people and the planet. The planet, all of whom are suffering because of ecological and environmental injustices. The policies then need to begin at home, and then we will have the authenticity to start challenging governments and others to act in the same way. And conscience making itself, and conscience incidentally was mentioned by Cardinal Turkson at the very end of his paper, but it was just sort of left hanging there as a quotation from Benedict XVI. But how can we make decisions in a way that honours our consciences, and what the role of the Holy Spirit in informing our conscience, and how does magisterial teaching influence what that conscience demands of us, as it were. And I think the magisterium is intended as a guide, but we may also need prophets who are prepared to act under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And what is the relation then between the two, the individual conscience and the collective conscience? And that is a difficult one, because under Benedict XVI there was a hardening of magisterial authority, and this may soften under Pope Francis. In other words, the stress on the role of the Spirit in the individual lives of the believer, which was characteristic before Benedict XVI, may start to resurface again. So it's not a new teaching, but it's about the balance between the two. And ironically, I believe that this may actually have more influence than a hard line. So in other words, if there's a softening about individual consciences in relation to the magisterium, this may actually make people more responsive to the magisterium, because there's a greater sense of freedom. Those aspects then, themes such as ecological conversion then, are also related to conscience. So our consciences are sensitized by this need for ecological conversion. And then finally, just in relation to this, I think Francis of Assisi was Christ-centered in his approach. So our consciences are informed by imago Christi, what Christ may or may not have done in those circumstances. And then the natural world as a source of healing. Pope, as I mentioned earlier, Pope John Paul II led nature retreats, and he often spoke of the wonder in the natural world, and had an aesthetic, and its aesthetic value and source of healing. And I think this, in a sense, is a prelude to some of these other aspects, but it also needs to be an ingredient in the way we come to understand our relationship with the natural world and with each other. So these aesthetic elements enrich the human life and cause us to be more responsive. And Rachel Carson herself wrote frequently about the theme of wonder, the wonder of the natural world, and that was what really drove her to write her Silent Spring. So our care or our concern for the natural world is often reinforced by this understanding of the natural world in our experiences with it, our experiences of its wonder, its beauty, and its understanding of healing. And so it relates then to the power of a studied attention, what Seaman Field often referred to, this idea of paying attention, which is very similar to prayer, that we could pay attention. So not just Francis of Assisi, who did this in relation to his own understanding of other creatures, but also if you add to this the Ignatian of Loyola understanding of Christ in all things, you get a very powerful combination. And that particular combination of Christ in all things and St. Francis is paying attention to creatures is also true, or is also combined in Pope Francis. So we can understand then the immanence of God in all things, the immanence of God in creation, not in a way that weakens the sense of transcendence, but in a way that sensitizes us to the beauty of the natural world and the way it can, if you like, enrich our lives, but also allow us to understand ourselves in relation to others, including the others of creation. And that's something that I've written about in my own book, The Wisdom of the Liminal, how we become who we are in relationship with other creatures and in an evolutionary and in an interactive and interlaced sense. And I'm coming near the end now. So human flourishing is inclusive then of the flourishing of other creatures in their own worlds. So they're not just there for our own use or there for our own enjoyment, they're also there, as it were, for the praise of the Creator. And so that means that salvation then is inclusive of the earth and other creatures. And they can even become instruments through which healing is promoted. So it's not pantheism, but it's immanence and transcendence coming together in what Turkson has called an integral ecology. But what I'm trying to do is flesh out what that integral ecology might potentially look like. And this is my last slide, so I'm going to take a sip of water because my voice is going. And this I want to end really with hints in the letter, his letter, Joy of the Gospel, and how this may impinge on his understanding of our responsibility to the wider natural world. Because I think if we end on a note of doom and gloom, then it's not going to work in terms of people taking up the mantle and being brave enough to face some of the huge problems and difficulties that we find ourselves in. So it will be a hope-filled message in the power of the resurrection that we've been sitting in the last few weeks. So all of creation will be restored in Christ and through the Holy Spirit. Climate change, ecological devastation and social injustices, yes, they are all present, but they're not the last word, not at least for those who are Christians. We need to reclaim our faith in the providential care of God and the ultimate hope in the power of the resurrection. And one way to do that, in a way which is common to all Catholics in particular, is through a deeper contemplation on the Eucharist, where prayer is united to action that is transforming the natural world into the mystical body of Christ. And so there are intermediate steps on the way. So just as liberation theology used some mystical contemplation, as it were, to inspire some of its activity, I believe something similar can happen for Catholics and Christians interested in or concerned about environmental and ecological injustices. And these intermediate steps between the eschatological future, where we celebrate the Eucharist, as it were, in an unbounded sense, will begin, and the feast of the reign of God. That, as it were, that intermediate step is in placing ourselves in the real struggles of those who are suffering through climate injustices. And they also take shape in the way we flesh out our own particular human responsibilities. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you for listening.
While I sit under this interrogating light.
Hello? Yeah, besides St. Francis, can you recommend any other authors to look out for regarding the, majesty of the environment? Really inspirational authors or saints to look up besides St. Francis?
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Bonaventure, I think, is also a Franciscan.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Bonaventure is also a Franciscan, and I think he's pretty inspirational to consider. But also, I think that Thomas Aquinas hasn't been given enough worth either. So in other words, although Thomas Aquinas didn't write specifically about ecology, some of his understanding of other creatures and also some of his understanding of virtues, for example, can be useful tools to think through some of these questions. So, hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
But in a sense, because St. Francis was the patron saint of ecology, he's an obvious one. Although we have to also put his own writing in the context, because he wasn't writing at a time of environmental devastation. So his own understanding of natural philosophy isn't necessarily the one that we presume it is. So he's not quite, I don't think he's quite as valuable for eco-theology in the way that some people have made out, because they've taken him outside the natural philosophy that he himself has embedded in. But it also depends on whether you're concerned to translate him into the contemporary context and how much weight you put on his particular historical context. So it's like any interpretation or hermeneutics. Is the same with the Bible, the biblical stories, the biblical narratives. What's really interesting now is that there's a new sort of wave of biblical interpretation, which is much more ecologically conscious. And so I think, as well as Francis of Assisi, we can go back to the biblical writers as well and look at some of that as a source. So if you're thinking about sources, that is another potential source. And then there are the contemporary writers. The Protestant writer Jürgen Moltmann has written an immense amount of work on this as well. That not all his writing is necessarily well received by Catholic scholars, but at the same time he's at least tried to make some of the bridges between creation. Dennis Edwards is another contemporary writer who's a Catholic who's written extensively on this. And he's written a book called Ecology at the Heart of Faith, and other books which draw on Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea. So some of the early church fathers were very useful, Maximus the Confessor as well. So there are, if you like, you can go back to the early church. There are also what I would call the contemporary feminist scholars as well, like Elizabeth Johnson and others, controversial perhaps, but it's one of the few areas where I would say you get this combination of very, very traditional early church teaching, including Bartholomew I, who's the ecumenical patriarchate, who's written extensively on environmental questions, alongside more radical writers in the feminist traditions. You get them both, you know, in terms of some of the practices they're talking about, saying quite similar things, which is astonishing. That in that sense, it lends itself then to appeal across a very broad spectrum of different positions. So it really depends on, you know, your own sort of journey, as it were, and your own preference in terms of where you feel drawn to, what kind of sources you want to draw on in order to get inspiration from.
I want to thank you. You really gave a very systematic introduction to the Catholic social teaching and ecology. So I really appreciate your lecture. I have two questions. I really liked the limits of the social Catholic teaching in the light of ecology. And that made me a lot of sense. But I'd like to ask, would you please give me a little more explanation on co-creation? And you said it's a problematic. And I thought that all the way along while I was studying some of ecology and theology. But quite a few eco-theologians are talking about co-creation is the alternative. But I have some feeling it's another form of domination of human beings. So I liked your observation, but I'd like to hear a little more about it. That's my first question. Second question is, I'm from South Korea, and we have a very pluralistic religious culture there. So we are doing last 10 years a dialogue between Buddhists, Confucians, and Christians and Taoists. How to look at ecology together. And it has been very enriching for us. So do you have any similar experience in your travel for the ecology?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Both very interesting questions. With the first one, I need to be clear that co-creation is only a very minor thread, but it is mentioned occasionally. And one of the reasons why I find it problematic is it's often being used by theologians, even from Chicago, from here, the Saigon Center, Philip Hefner and others, to talk about co-creation in relation to modern technologies. And I worry that it can be used to endorse anything we want to do. So any technology that we want to use, any manipulation we choose, it can be used to reinforce that. Now, I don't think it was intended to mean that, but there's a danger there, which is why I call it under the limits. So that's really why I think co-creation. There's also, of course, the issue of restoration, practices of ecological restoration that many environmental advocates are starting to push for now. And that is a whole another philosophical and theological discussion that we could have had and we haven't. It's not discussed at all in any of the encyclicals I've come across, this idea of ecological restoration. But behind it is the idea that we know what particular historical period we need to go back to, and that as a result of our damaging practices, we can somehow repair that damage through ecological restoration. I think it can be thought of in a positive way in terms of bringing in a new kind of future. If we start to use the language of co-creation in that context, there are also problems and issues of what I would call hubris. In other words, too great a sense of our own power over the natural world. So again, that's another. Ecological restoration is another ambiguous angle. The idea of the pluralistic culture and Buddhist. I've actually talked to some Confucian and a Korean theologian myself a few times about some aspects of theology, and the idea of wisdom is something which is very common. The virtue of wisdom is common for both Koreans and Christian thinkers. So the idea of practical wisdom and wisdom more generally, I think, is something that's shared between Buddhist and and Christian. So that may be a way of saying that we need to develop wisdom in order to treat the natural world aright, and therefore it can be a shared task between Buddhist and Christian communities. And I have a lot to learn from the Confucian tradition and their understanding of wisdom and so on. So I think that there can be something for coming together around that. There is another, I used to work with the International Consultancy on Religion, Education and Culture before I did, or just after I did my doctorate in Ecology and Theology. And that particular organisation eventually transmuted into something else called the Alliance of Religion and Conservation. And that Alliance of Religion and Conservation includes a whole range of different religious traditions. And they've come together on practical projects. So it's often through the practical projects that you can get, kind of mutual understanding. So I would say that if we are dealing with people with very different religious faiths, and if we work together with them in practices, and there can be, it generates the will, as it were, to share some of these other areas where we may or may not differ from a more theoretical starting point.
Celia, thank you. This is probably more in line with also what Michael was talking about. You mentioned looking to sources that give us inspiration as we think in our own ways about how to think about these issues. And sources for many of us in business was Rerum Novarum and the whole idea of the labor unions and the whole controversy of some of the practices of business and capitalism over time. Youth in the sections of Advanced Reality where he took on the economic system were very encouraging to give meaning to many of us. Do you think that tradition or language plays a role in this whole idea of how we think about ecology, the whole issue of dignity of work and labor?
Yeah, I mean, I think I quoted just one tiny quotation from Laborum Existens, and that one was more about how our understanding of work or vocation needed to be connected with the natural world. But I think when those encyclicals were being written, talking about, I don't think the environmental consciousness had quite come to the surface in the way it has now. So I think I think the attention to a different way of thinking about our work is also really important. I think it's underdeveloped in the encyclicals in relation to environmental questions. So there's a thread in there, but it's underdeveloped, and it needs more people or others maybe to build on what's there, and then maybe even transform it. We may see that in the next encyclical. I don't know. I'm not, as I said, I've pointed at a few of the things which may come up, but there's an awful lot to say that could be said. He needs about 3 encyclicals to cover everything. So I know that's rather vague, but I can't think of anything else.
Buenas noches.
Okay, thank you.
Cuando yo recibí la invitación para participar en este evento, empecé a pensar desde el punto de vista filosófico.
When I got invited to participate in this event, I started wrestling with the subject matter from a philosophical point of view.
Porque al querer relacionar ecología con la Iglesia Católica, hay que pensar que, como decimos en filosofía, el objeto material, tanto de la Iglesia, llamémoslo así, o de la teología, como de la ecología, es el ser humano.
So when I was trying to establish a relationship between ecology and the church, I wanted to look especially at the subject matter, meaning what's the church dealing with and what's ecology dealing with.
Pero hay una diferencia en el objeto formal.
But while the material object is the same, there is a difference with the formal object. He's using philosophical distinctions here.
Porque la Iglesia trata del ser humano en orden a su integración en el cuerpo místico de Cristo,
So while both of them coincide that the human subject is the same material object, from a formal point of view, the church addresses the question of the human being in relationship to its bond in the mystical body of Christ,
en lo cual consiste la salvación del género humano.
which consists in the salvation of the human being.
Y la ecología considera al ser humano en relación con toda la naturaleza o con toda la creación.
While the human being, from the point of view of ecology, is mainly treated in relationship to all of nature.
Entonces, el objeto material es el mismo, hay una diferencia por el objeto formal. Deberíamos entonces, al querer relacionar iglesia con ecología, tener bien claro lo que se entiende por iglesia y bien claro lo que se entiende por ecología.
So given these differences in the material object and the formal object between ecology and church, it's also very important to understand what we mean when we're talking about church and what we mean when we're talking about ecology.
El Concilio Vaticano II, en la constitución de la Iglesia en el mundo actual, que se llama Gaudium et Spes en latín, gozo y esperanza, define la Iglesia como una reunión de los creyentes en Cristo, verdadero Dios, verdadero hombre, que bajo la guía del Espíritu Santo peregrinan hacia el Padre Celestial.
He's giving you a whole quote from Gaudium et Spes, but the definition of the church as this union of all the believers who walk together towards union with the Father through the Son.
Esta reunión de los seres humanos, creyentes en Cristo, verdadero hombre, y que en la Iglesia ha sido entendida de manera muy diversa entre los mismos católicos.
So the issue is also that this definition of the communal aspect of all these believers as being in the church has been also understood in a variety of ways by the Catholics themselves.
Porque algunos consideraron la Iglesia Católica como una sociedad perfecta
Because some looked at the church as a perfect society
antes del Concilio Vaticano II,
before the Second Vatican Council.
pero muchos católicos siguen pensando igual.
But some Catholics still think the same way.
Y al mismo tiempo, por una antropología decadente o que le faltan elementos, no considera al ser humano espíritu y materia, sino solamente espíritu. Como decían antes, salvar almas.
So when you look, for example, at the old expression to save souls, there has been sort of distorted anthropology that has reduced both aspects, the material and the spiritual, and the human being to simply the spiritual.
De ahí que para poder tratar este tema de Iglesia Católica y ecología, a mí me parece que el primer trabajo debería ser aclarar qué entendemos por Iglesia y por Iglesia Católica cabalmente.
So therefore, in dealing with the relationship between ecology and the church, I think that the first step would be to really understand what we mean by church and more specifically Catholic Church.
Okay, I think we have a nominative comment.
Sí, no voy a preguntar nada, solo quería aportar, porque es imposible que la Iglesia Católica haga algo en ecología mientras siga pensando que solo debe hacer sacramentos. Muchas gracias.
So his claim is that the Catholic Church, it would be impossible for the Catholic Church to contribute to ecology if it continues to reduce its scope or its goal to just the sacramental realm,
Yeah.
meaning the sacred, and not, I guess, the involvement in the material and the social.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying, and I think what you're saying is that we cannot align theology directly with the scientific understanding of the natural world. So there's a distinction between nature and creation, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that there needs to be a distinction between nature and the natural world is understood by the sciences and the creation is understood theologically. And so on that basis, I haven't gone into this. All I've done today is reiterated some of the Catholic social thought and the way that's been put in Catholic social teaching. But of course there has been some slippage in some of the way that's been articulated, even in official statements of the Church, which has meant that there hasn't been sufficient clarity in what is meant by ecology or what is meant by the Church in the particular extracts that I have been using. But when I have done eco-theology myself, or when I've written about evolutionary understanding, I've always taken care to interpret the two as coming together in an analogous way. So you have, if you like, the theodramatic understanding of a relationship between God, humanity, and the natural world. But you also have alongside that analogous hints in the ecological sphere, which are different, but they are similar by analogy. So if you want to use philosophical understanding, is analogy of being, which I think is the most productive. So the ecology, which basically means home, or Ernst Haeckel understood ecology as meaning home, is about our interrelationships in the material bondedness of our life. Whereas creation is more about the creation of being as such. And so in that sense, my own view follows that of Thomas Aquinas and others that distinguish between creation and nature, but at the same time there are parallels which allow us to have some resonance with scientists, so we're not just speaking in a language which is alien to scientists. So we need to. So my own view is that our own faith needs to seek understanding through trying to learn more about the sciences. So philosophy then becomes the handmaiden of theology, and so does science. So theology isn't taking or being reduced to the scientific enterprise, but is understanding itself in relation to those scientific enterprises and taking account of them. And that has been true of the encyclicals that I've read, that they have taken account of the social sciences, but maybe not enough. They've taken account of ecological sciences, but maybe not quite enough as yet. But what's different perhaps with Pope Francis is that he may take a greater account of the significance of other creatures, creaturely theology, in addition to the just narrowly formed focused on the church as a human community. Because although the church is a human community, the scope of deep incarnation is one that embraces the whole of the natural order, and is not, as with Maximus the Confessor, it's a cosmic liturgy. So our liturgy can be thought of in a cosmic way, and this goes back to very ancient teaching. So it's not some newfangled philosophy. It's one that goes back to the ancient teaching of the church, that we are living, as it were, in a world that's charged with the spiritual beings of other beings, and therefore we need to see ourselves as entangled, as it were, with other creatures. Not in a way that means that we're exactly the same, but in a way that helps our theology to become more enlarged and enriched by our knowledge of science and our knowledge of the social sciences. And that's, I think, what we've been trying to do in this whole conference, is to look at some of the results of social science analysis, political analysis, ecological analysis, and say, where do we move from here? I think you're right that an understanding of how ecology and theology can connect and fit together is often muddled and not sufficiently clarified. I think often in Catholic social thought, when it talks about the church, it means the Catholic Church and not the wider universal church. But my understanding is that we should see the church in a universal sense as well, that we should open our doors to thinking through what this might mean in a wider context of other denominations, as well as the particular Catholic tradition in which I'm placed. But the Catholic Church is also a global church, and that means we need to listen to those who are coming from other areas, and on that basis I appreciate your comments and thank you for your contribution.
Great, and with that, we'd like to thank Celia Deane-Drummond both for her address and for enduring what subjectively feels like a final interrogation.
Thanks, I'll be brief, but I just want to be sure that we get the very pleasant task of thanking people out there before we all adjourn. I want to thank Karen and Francis and Anna and the staff of the center for doing a tremendous job and keeping everything moving. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers, especially those who have come from very far away. Quiero agradecer especialmente los que viajaron desde lejos para participar en la conferencia. And I also want to thank everybody who came to listen. It's been a marathon and I hope very enriching as well. I hope we see you again. We have many events and we would love to see you again, and I hope that this conference has given us some impetus for, Celia said, authenticity in our thought and in our action with regard to these issues. So thanks very much and good night.